So I'm Florence, I'm a PhD student at Queen Mary University of London. I'm actually a computer science student now, but I originally, I still am an archaeologist. And yeah, so I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results of my PhD project so far. And this presentation is split into 3 sections, so I'm going to be giving some context to the research, then presenting a case study before moving on to broader discussion and looking at future work. So first of all, the context. I really love literature reviews, so you're getting this kind of strange spider diagram here, but hopefully it'll help to kind of visualize the different areas that I'm pulling on for this. So for my PhD project, I coined the term generative archaeology games, which refers to games with procedurally generated content, that is, content that's created by algorithms, not by hand, which I want to encourage players to interpret archaeologically and record. And that also needs some unpacking, but as I and, for example, Livingston et al. Think environmental storytelling in games is very much akin to archaeological interpretation, because it's about trying to interpret what happened in a place based on material remains, and indeed this is something that happens in walking simulators a lot, which have already been mentioned today. And in archaeogaming there has already been a lot of discussion of procedural generation, probably most notably the No Man's Sky archaeological survey, and also, for example, Sean Graham has done sort of a playthrough of Minecraft. And also, as we've seen today, there's a lot of kind of exploring and experimentation around archaeological games, which is really great to see. And for example, Tara Copplestone has written about games as process, so not just viewing games as sort of like an outcome, but actually the process of making a game can change how you see archaeology. But to date, as far as I know, there hasn't necessarily been sort of archaeological game creation with procedural generation, so I'm kind of trying to tie these separate areas together. And the term generative archaeology games builds on the term generative forensic games, which was coined by my supervisor, Mike Cook, and that's the idea that players interpret the output of a generative system, which in a way is very kind of akin to archaeology, right? It's this idea of trying to work out exactly how a game system works. And looking more towards sort of computer science and games AI research, generally procedural generation research is based on sort of spatial generation, so level generation, as opposed to narrative procedural storytelling and narrative. But there is sort of a subsection of research on procedural storytelling, and for example, Ryan has talked about how if you want to kind of have this kind of like level of randomness with narratives, you really need to curate the output. Then you have sort of a slightly different approach from Adams, who's one of the developers of Dwarf Fortress, which of course is a very famous game with procedural generation in it. And he talks about emergent narratives, so the idea that players create narratives themselves, which again is something that's been talked about a lot today, so you can see kind of all of these things are connected. But now, object biographies, which of course is in my title, so I need to link it to that. As many of you probably know, the idea of object biographies in archaeology is to kind of trace the life cycle of an artifact. And there have been lots of different approaches to that, whether that be sort of in terms of creative writing. And there have already been a lot of work on digital object biographies. For example, Colleen Morgan has looked at object biographies, and Second Life, for example, and also Zuani has looked at the potential of digital object biographies in terms of the curation crisis in archaeology. And of course, there's been criticism of it as well. So, for example, some archaeologists have suggested we should think about object itineraries instead of object biographies, but that may be a matter of semantics. Okay, so now I've said all that. Are there object biographies in games already? Well, of course there are. I've already mentioned Dwarf Fortress, which has procedurally generated content in it, including artifacts which have these kind of rich and interesting kind of backgrounds, as you can see in the image on the screen. And then there's another example of a game, not with procedurally generated content in it, but which has sort of objects with almost like a sense of personhood, is Disco Elysium. Kind of brought that up just because it's an interesting example of objects that actually directly talk to a narrator, so a very kind of like creative approach to that. But what is the case study? What is a more kind of definitive example of how this might work? So recently I conducted a player study on a game that was originally made by my supervisor called Napping Beside Remains. It's quite a simple game in a lot of ways, as you can see on the screen, kind of simple abstract graphics, and the idea is there's a procedurally generated ruined village, and you can walk around as this little @ symbol and walk into different objects and read descriptions, and through that you can potentially get a sense of what happens to this village, why is it ruined. And the idea with the player survey was to see if players would actually try and interpret what happens to this place, and if so, how? What were they basing that interpretation on? Are players already applying archaeological storytelling? And so we did this survey, which was advertised online and had various different questions in a Google form. And we also collected sort of player data on how they moved through the game as well, the duration, what objects they interacted with, because we wanted to kind of compare that with the answers that we got as well. And we had two different seeds, so two different instances of the game, which were two different maps, which I'll show in a second. And one of the questions that I really want to focus on for this presentation is whether players would refer to an anachronistic object which we deliberately put in the world to try and get people to respond to it, and whether this affected their interpretation of the village. Yeah, on the screen you can see sort of the two different versions of the village that people played. And the idea behind this is that we wanted kind of two divergent maps to also see if potentially kind of the spatial arrangement of the village might change people's responses as well. And as you can see on the screen, there was a building that is never explicitly referred to as a church in the game, but it has pews and things that might suggest that it is. So for ease of reference, it's called a church here. And that's where the pocket watch, which was the anachronistic object which we deliberately put in for some survey respondents, was placed. And every player always starts at position S. And yeah, so that's kind of a summary of that. And so at this stage, can only provide really preliminary results, because actually we got a lot more responses than we were expecting, because really from the start this was kind of a pilot experimental project, and we didn't even know if that many people would be interested in responding to this, and as it turns out they were, even with kind of this, what you might think is quite a simple game, actually kind of inspired a lot of people to write very different and interesting responses. And on the screen here, you can see sort of some of the initial kind of breakdown of the data that we've done in terms of looking at the anachronistic objects, the pocket watch, and other objects. Because there was a question on the survey which asked respondents to pick one object from the game and explain how they thought it came to be in the village, and also what they based that idea on. And there were some limitations in terms of data collection, which is why there are some discrepancies there between the different tables. But how does this actually relate to object biographies? So in kind of the study of emergent narratives in games, there's this idea of evaluating player retellings. So what kind of stories do players tell about their gameplay experience? And in a sense, this is what respondents were doing when they replied to the survey. They were retelling their experience of the game. And there's this kind of sense of the original kind of abstract idea of this pocket watch as it appeared in the game as this symbol, then becoming kind of associated with players' ideas of what a pocket watch is and what that might mean, and then sort of further on this kind of like meta object biography becoming part of the stories that they told. And you can see on screen here some of the responses. And what's really interesting is that people really put the pocket watch in context with other kind of material culture that they found in the village. They said that it seemed inconsistent with the technology, it was out of place. So people were kind of, there is this sense of archaeological interpretation in that they were comparing other pieces of material culture within the game and contextualizing this object in light of that. So in terms of future work, because we have this sort of player data moving through the game, but also these free text responses, we're going to do some kind of mixed methods analysis going forward. More broadly with my PhD, something that I'm really interested in doing is looking at this concept, which is keepsake games, which is something that Xingyin Ke has worked on in the tabletop role-playing kind of space. And the idea of a keepsake game is that through the process of gameplay, you create a physical artifact. As part of that, so that could be a map, it could be something else. And in this way, I'm hoping to kind of combine PCG archaeological storytelling with a more kind of analog sort of like process of archaeological recording, because after all, archaeological recording can be through drawing plans and things like that, and that can also be an aspect of a keepsake game as Core discusses it. And finally, I kind of see object biographies as sort of an interesting lens to use to look at sort of the results of the survey, and but I want to sort of like see it as the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it, and to follow what Jazin's work, in which he kind of looks at querying object biographies, sort of questioning sort of norms around objects and how we expect them to kind of appear in people's lives. And those are all my sources, which can be seen later, probably more easily. Thank you very much.